In 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated by Serbian nationalist Gavrilo Princip. This would see the beginning of World War I. With World War I came the use of trench warfare. And as the war progressed, a line of trenches formed stretching all the way from the North Sea to Switzerland. In the beginning, trenches were not intended for permanent use. They were set up as temporary emplacements, but as the war progressed, it turned into a virtual stalemate, and as a result, the trenches were dug deeper into very elaborate systems.
Life in the trenches was grueling. Soldiers dealt with a variety of daily struggles, anything from diseases to the environment. In the environment, they had sweltering hot summers where they would rarely bathe, freezing winters, and lots of rain, which would flood the trenches and crumble the walls.
Diseases included trench foot, which is a fungal infection that thrived in cold, wet conditions that were found in the trenches, and the only cure was a powder that horribly dried and cracked the skin, but if it was not treated, it could cause gangrene if not dealt with. Lice was also another factor, which would be periodically dealt with, but not completely exterminated, as eggs would be caught in the lining of the coats. Brown and black rats were vermin, which scurried around the trenches and would gorge on the countless cadavers laying on the flooding grounds. Frogs, horned beetles, slugs, and other little aquatic creatures also got in the way of overall daily life and lived in the trenches due to the flooding. Nits prompted many soldiers to shave their heads to avoid getting them.
There was also frostbite in the winter and dehydration in the summer. Shell shock, which was mental trauma from the war. They called it shell shock because there was not such a thing as PTSD then. The Spanish flu was also common, along with the common cold outbreaks. There was also contaminated water supplies from time to time. There were other challenges. Newbies would look over the parapet and get shot. Bullets would come in the trench and ricochet off the walls. Clear nights meant enemy raids, and waking up just before dawn to start guard duty.
And now the basic layout of the trenches. For the Allies, there were four main types of trenches. There was the front line trench. This was the forwardmost trench, and where they launched attacks from. Next, a ways back from it, was the support trench. This trench was used to house supplies, extra men, and was basically used as a backup in case the forward trench was sacked or taken over. It was also to resupply the front line. Finally, in the back was the reserve trench. This held all the men that were on their rotation break, and it was a chance for some of the men to rest and store even more supplies and men. Finally, there were these little connector trenches. These were to transport men from trench to trench so that they wouldn't have to climb over the top and risk getting shot at. To increase morale, the men were rotated around on a 3-week rotation schedule. This meant 1 week in the frontline trench, a 2nd week in the support trench, and a 3rd week in the reserve trench. This meant that the men would not be constantly in the ring of it all and under fire, and got a chance to relax every couple of weeks, and this was a great boost to the morale. The Germans, on the other hand, built large mazes for their trench systems. They weren't in straight lines, and it would zigzag all over the place, and so it wasn't as just linear as the other ones were. And then they'd have bunkers underneath the officers and men to sleep in versus exposed openings. Both sides developed new technologies which helped them, but in the end they ended up just creating more of a stalemate by using them. These included machine guns, different forms of poison gas, and tanks. The British were the first to make use of the machine gun with the Maxim gun, and the Germans soon followed. The machine gun caused widespread chaos across the trench battles and killed many men. Gas was also used. This included tear gas, which caused blindness, mustard gas, which was the new and improved version of chlorine gas, and this would burn your lungs and your skin if it came in contact with it. It would also burn your eyes, and it's just a really devastating form of gas. Then there were tanks. Tanks were invented right around the time of the beginning of the war, and so they weren't very reliable. They had low speeds, they weren't able to travel very far. On the other hand, they were able to make pretty sharp turns and cross the trenches and climb some pretty steep surfaces, but overall they didn't do much besides strike fear into the enemy. So most of you probably already know, but for those of you who don't, these technologies really aided to the futility of the war. The trenches never really moved, and no one ever gained much territory than a few miles here or there, and so the war ended in a stalemate.
Some of the long-term environmental results were shells plus miscellaneous items littered the areas around the trenches, which were recovered during the yearly iron harvest. The trenches themselves left huge scars in the land which have yet to be completely filled due to their frequencies. Also, dead bodies were a frequent sight, and the bones are still being found today. Chemical ammo is still found in construction sites and poses risks to civilians. The extra chemicals at the end of the war were dumped into the Baltic Sea by the parties that participated in the war. Rust also contaminates the soil from all the miscellaneous barbed wire, shells, and other armaments found, and then the areas that the trenches lived in have devastated the local flora populations.
On Christmas, 1914, this fighting stopped completely. This is the first time and only time it ever happened during the war. Men from both sides emerged and played soccer and sung Christmas carols together.
Y'all ready for this?